You're listening to the Downeast Mike podcast, the quirky little podcast from Maine. And now, your host, Downeast Mike. Good morning, everybody. This is Downeast Mike. Welcome to the Downeast Mike podcast. This is Downeast Mike episode 75 with news and commentary for January 28th, 2023. And our motto here is some of this is whimsy, some of it's true, and the interpretation of it all is entirely up to you. And did you know that the Downeast Mike podcast contains no mean words, just wholesome goodness from Downeast, Maine? It's a historical, literary, auditory candy store. I just throw those lines in there to get me warmed up a little bit. We are quite fired up today, I got to tell you. It's the weekend, and we've had our Maxwell House coffee pumped into us, and we're just kind of spinning around the room, just raring to go with energy for this podcast. It's so fired up. We found out the other day, we had a lady email us, and she said, Downeast Mike, I've got to tell you that you're quite valuable to us here at the nursing home. In my room, I put your podcast on several times a week and close the door. And the other residents of the nursing home will come by later and they'll look at me quite slyly when we push our wheelchairs out for recreation time in the center of the nursing home. And they'll look at me and they'll say, Isabel, I know you had a male visitor the other day. I heard him talking. And I'll just tell them, well, that's nice. Yes, I did have a visitor. And then they say, Isabel, he seems to repeat himself a lot. I put the glass up to the wall and I could hear what he was saying. And he's saying the same thing he said last week. So I don't dare tell them Downeast Mike, but what I do is I play your podcast over and over again, and they think I've got a male visitor. So I feel bad for them having to do that. But that's entertaining at some level. Let's look at the headlines for today, or do I want to tell you what's coming up? What's coming up in today's podcast is Kerry wins the New Hampshire primary that was on this day in 2004. Nation's first telephone exchange, that was in 1878. And Penobscot jail dungeon, you didn't know they had a dungeon. We'll look into that a little bit. And then our feature story today, our deep dive, is Jumpin' Frenchmen of Moosehead Lake. So let's go right to the international world headlines. Tyree Nichols' parents speak out following the release of police camera footage. The Israeli military is boosting forces in the West Bank. How is any of this news? Pence on classified records, mistakes were made. Court releases video of Paul Pelosi hammer attack, adding chilling details. TJ Holmes and Amy Robach officially exit ABC, reportedly with compensation packages after office romance. And let's see, anything else is some sports news. 3 dead as torrential rain causes disastrous flooding in New Zealand. Ukraine says Russia's putting inflatable tanks on the battlefield, but the decoys deflated. Dallas police officers fired 55 times at an 18-year-old after he shot cop. Well, it sure is a lot of happy news there. Let's see if there's anything Maine-related in the local news. We'll take any level of progress. Maine advocates react to FDA proposal easing blood donation restrictions for gay and bisexual men. Maine businesses and schools get smart at artificial intelligence meeting. I don't know what that is. Anything else in local news? It's really hot. Maine town garage burns down, destroying fleet of plow trucks. Where was that? Where did we destroy a fleet of snow plows and snow removal? 2 loud explosions in Peru, Maine. 11:30 p.m. Thursday in Peru Center Road. Wow. And the fire chief, Dan Kerry, says, I was the first on the scene. When we got here, the building was already collapsed on itself. We're a small town. We stick together. Maybe something as simple as residents and their pickups opening up the roads for the people. Wow. Okay, well that's enough local news. Let's get to our podcast, and we have happy birthday today to Stephanie of Cape Elizabeth. They just bought a house in town, and they're finding the cost of living to be quite high. And happy birthday to Mary in Richmond. Mary turned 76. She's a grandmother of 6, and she's real pleased that the ice is finally in the pond for fishing. On this day in 2004, Kerry won the New Hampshire primary with 39% of the vote. Howard Dean was 26%, John Edwards 12%, Wesley Clark 13%, Joe Lieberman 9%, Dennis Kucinich 1%, Al Sharpton 0%. I remember that primary. We actually went to a small room and heard Dennis Kucinich speak. Quite a smart guy. But he didn't get too far, did he? 1% of the vote. On this day in 1978, they were looking back 100 years to the first commercial telephone exchange. And 100 years ago this week in telegrapher George Coy shouted into a primitive telephone handset, "What is wanted?" to inaugurate the first commercial telephone exchange. At the other end of the line on January 28, 1878, was one of an original 21 New Haven, Connecticut subscribers to the wondrous service, which linked them by voice at a cost of $1.50 a month. That's actually kind of high, isn't it? Despite its modest beginning, the exchange that came less than 1 year after Alexander Graham Bell's telephone patent was a network of wires that was to spawn one of the United States' largest businesses. The telephone was destined to save lives and change lifestyles, to comfort some and harass others, but most of all to make the world seem much smaller. The rustic switchboard that Coy fashioned from carriage bolts, teapot handles, and wires from a woman's bustle has not survived, but a copy and diagrams have. For all the simplicity of concept, the process of handling calls was actually a slow, clumsy process, said history buff Raoul Benson, and he's the retired director of the Southern New England Telephone, NT&T, I remember that. Original callers merely unhooked the one-piece telephone resembling an early receiver and pushed a button on a small wall board to signal the world's first telephone operator. That was 17-year-old Louis Frost, son of the exchange's co-founder, Herrick Frost. Then followed about 6 separate movements to tie the caller into the system, and it hooked them into an electric noisemaker called Coy's Chicken to squawk at the called in, and finally to hook up the two parties. Now, these people were just beyond clever to come up with this stuff. There were drawbacks. A single call tied up the entire exchange. Some of my listeners are old enough to remember this probably. The handpiece had to be shifted from mouth to ear. Clear conversation was not the rule. The innovation should not be taken lightly, Benson said during a telephone interview, of course, from his Florida vacation retreat. The network telephone wires to subscribers' homes came before central electricity. An initial newspaper advertisement reassured readers that no batteries were needed in the home. Frost, to whom Benson gives much of the credit for the first exchange, was able to raise the crucial $600 from an undoubtedly skeptical relative. And as Bell himself said during an April 1877 speech, the message could be quietly sent as the telephone leaves no record behind it. The world had not yet dreamed up the wiretap. In less than a month after the Monday opening of the exchange, the subscription list had grown to 50, 138% increase. Listed in the world's first telephone directory. Isn't that something? It listed subscribers by categories: residences, boarding stables, meat, and fish markets. Frost was a man of vision, attracting interest and new customers with a series of publicity schemes that seemed to anticipate radio and television. He placed a telephone in a weather observer's office and advertised that subscribers could call for information. He covered a rifle match by having observers man telephones. And then on November 4th, he extended the principle to the local elections. Meriden, the world's second exchange, and later Bridgeport and Hartford were among the rush of commercial operations that followed. Isn't that something? Let's see, what else on this day? 1978, Roy Rogers came home from the hospital. He had a 2-week stay at the Mary Hospital in Torrance, California. He had had surgery to clear a blocked artery. Good old Roy Rogers. TV sets were stolen on this day in Lewiston. 2 television sets and 2 car stereo decks stolen from Sears and Roebuck on Main Street in Lewiston. Sears and Rubbish, they used to call it. We found Conway Twitty was playing at the Portland City Hall Auditorium Sunday, February 5th. The advertisement was on this day, 1978. Tickets were $7, $6, and $5. It was Conway Twitty and the Twitty Birds. Sonny James and the Southern Gentlemen. I don't remember him too much. Margot Smith and the Love Explosion Band. Boy, that must be a stretch, huh? We saw, what else? A baked bean supper at the Methodist Church in Lisbon Falls. Adults were $2. How come? Well, under 6 was 50 cents. That's good. Live music at the American Legion Post. It was Bob Bedard and his combo. That's 4 people, right? In that case, I think. And what else? We have some movies. Bill Cosby and Sidney Poitier, A Piece of the Action. That's where we wouldn't go too deep into that one. But let's see. The Blend. We're coming to Auburn at the Holiday Inn, Washington Street in Auburn. It was February 3rd, Friday. Oh, that's exciting. The Blend. George Burns and John Denver and Oh God were playing at the Bellevue Theater. Let's go back further, though. Let's go back to this day in 1885. And we have a man named John Cash said in presence of the police today that he was a Fenian and that he was the man who drove the cab in which the men rode who murdered Lord Cavanagh and Mr. Burke in Phoenix Park, Dublin. So John Cash, and this was out of Hamilton, Ontario. He had just arrived from Ireland. John Cash. A little local news. Let's see. 2 roughs named Shattuck and Gallons terrorized the village of Shattuckville, Mass. on Tuesday night. The United States steamer Dallas, the captain was named Lay, arrived in Rockland Monday afternoon. Reports having towed into Rockland the day previous the British brig S.N. Collimore with Captain Davis, 10 days out of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, bound for Portland with ballast. The American schooner Palestine of New York, with Captain E. Chadwick from Calais for Fall River, Rhode Island, 22 days out with a cargo of lumber. The brig Collimore was found helpless in the ice at Fox Island Thoroughfare, short of stores, and in danger of being driven on the rocks by the ice. The schooner Palestine was found at anchor in the ice off Widow's Island with rudder disabled, and Shoe Gore, can't quite read that, having struck on Fish Point Ledge the 25th during thick weather. The same day, the Dallas released from the ice in the same locality the American schooner Sarah Lane of Ellsworth and towed her east into clear water on her way to Deer Isle. Monday, the Dallas also released the American schooner Maud S. of North Haven, helpless in the ice in Perry's Cove, and towed her to North Haven. Monday afternoon, Dallas brought in the American schooner Conqueror of Belfast for Rockland after releasing her from the ice in Fox Island Thoroughfare, and the British schooner Brenton of Yarmouth, Captain Gardner for New York with herring. The drift ice in Fox Island Thoroughfare is bad in places. The understatement of 1885. There's kind of a pattern there, so it's the steamer Dallas hauling in all these ships that get stuck in the ice. What else do we have for local news on this day? 13 cars loaded with cattle passed through Lewiston. Washington's birthday this year comes on Sunday. Loud is the lament of the school children. We have Washington's birthday off this year, but it's President's Day now, they're calling it. A gay party of snowshoes were on the fields and hills Tuesday evening. This is in a time when gay meant something else, what it means today. They're dropped into the police station Tuesday evening when but one of the officers was in, a sad, long-faced looking tramp who looked like the late Dauphin in disguise. He sat down and pulled out a pipe. He looked at the bowl of his pipe and acted surprised. "Strange piece o' forgetfulness," muttered he, "to forget this load, this here pipe. Nothing settles anyone's nerves like a smoke before a long walk." He mused over the pipe and hunted in his pockets. In one of the pockets he found a hole. He turned it out to the policeman and said that this was where tobacco, knife, and matches had slid through. The policeman gave him tobacco and a match and loaned him a knife. Oh. The man packed a week's smoking into the bowl of the pipe and leaned back meditatively while blue rings floated up in the face of the clock that ticks over the loungers' chairs in the police station. He elevated his feet and closed his eyes. He appeared sunk in thought. "You don't happen to have a dime to replace the one that slid through the hole," said he, arousing from meditation. The police officer said that he didn't. Then the officer drew out the big book that all lodgers at the police station are obliged to face, and the tramp decided not to register. Out of his pocket, he drew a dime and said he guessed he would take in the DeWitt, and he left. Great story there. It snowed in on this day. In Troy, New York, all the trains were stopped. Troy was shut up by snow. 7 inches of snow fell last night and today. Railroads are blockaded. Trains from Montreal last night were stalled in the snowdrifts at Rutland and West Chazy and delayed 5 hours. It was still snowing hard, and travel is entirely suspended on the Troy and Boston Railroad. Little note here about the president and his living. An impression has been artfully created that the expenses in the White House absorb the salary of $50,000 a year allowed him by Congress. This is not the last foundation for this belief. The only charges that fall directly on the president are the maintenance of the household, his personal outfit, and a limited number of so-called state dinners to the diplomatic body, the judiciary, and members of Congress. Everything else is paid from the public treasury and in other ways. The White House is furnished, heated, and lighted by large appropriations, a part of which were diverted by late presidents to different uses. The music at receptions is provided from the Marine Band. Large conservatories kept up at a cost of $8,000 or $10,000 a year furnish the flowers and plants for decoration. Nearly all the servants are disguised messengers or laborers on the payrolls. The steward is a salaried official. Oh, anyway, that's quite the story. $50,000 a year he's paid. Let's see, a lady of Washburn made an election of a bet of candy with Mr. Fred Doherty, a commercial traveler. Mr. Doherty is a good Republican. He lost his bet, and not long ago the lady received by express an immense candy cane, perhaps 3 feet long. It's all so twisted. Let's see, out of Bangor, a few days ago, 20 of the prisoners in the Penobscot County Jail refused to go into the shop to work. Mr. Bragdon, the guard, after considerable trouble, compelled them to go to work as usual. After getting into the shop, there was further trouble, and Mr. Bragdon took the ringleader, a man by the name of Hart, back into the jail. Mr. Bragdon was conducting Hart to one of the upper cells when Hart made an attempt to throw Bragdon over the railing and into the corridor below. Had Hart succeeded in the attempt, Bragdon would undoubtedly have been killed, as he would have fallen a number of feet onto a brick floor. So Hart and 4 or 5 others were placed in dungeons and kept there for several days. A dungeon at Penobscot County Jail is probably still in use. Let's get to our feature story of the day, the Jumpers of Maine. Now, this is from Popular Science from December of 1880. It's written by George M. Beard, M.D. About 2 years ago, my attention was directed by my friend to the fact that in the northern part of Maine, especially in the region of Moosehead Lake, there were to be found a class of people who presented most incredible nervous phenomena. These people were called, in the language of that region, jumpers, or jumping Frenchmen. It was claimed that all or most of them were of French descent and of Canadian birth, and that their occupation was mainly that of lumbering in the Maine woods. And this is reference American Neurological Association, June 1880. So this doctor had been introduced to these jumping Frenchmen by somebody else who had amused himself watching and playing with these unfortunates. In accordance with the request of so-and-so, so-and-so, I began at that time an investigation of the subject through all accessible sources, and this year I visited Moosehead Lake in company with my friend Dr. Edward Steese and made the investigations herein recorded. I found 2 of the jumpers employed about the hotel. So much for the lumbering, huh? With one of them, a young man, 27 years of age, I made the following experiments. And here's where we're going to discover that this doctor's a wicked tool. While sitting in a chair with a knife in his hand with which he was about to cut his tobacco, he was struck sharply on the shoulder and told to throw it. Almost as quick as the explosion of a pistol, he threw the knife, and it stuck in a beam opposite. At the same time, he repeated the order, throw it, and with a certain cry as of terror or alarm. A moment after, while filling his pipe with tobacco, he was again slapped on the shoulder and told to throw it. He threw the tobacco and the pipe on the grass, at least a rod away, with the same cry and the same suddenness and explosiveness of movement. While standing near one of the employees of the house, he was told to strike, and he struck him violently on the cheek. I took this person into the quiet of my own room, only my friend being with me, in order that the experiments might be made without interruption or disturbance. I sat down by him, explained to him the object of my visit, conversed with him in regard to his family history and his own personal experience and observation of his peculiarity, and every now and then during the conversation I struck him without warning on the shoulder or on the back, or I mildly kicked him, and every time he was so struck he moved his shoulders upward slightly, sometimes moving both the shoulders and the arms, with or without the peculiar cry. He knew that I was studying his case. He knew that the kicks and strokes were coming from me, and yet he could not avoid making a slight jumper motion as though startled. I know if I was being punched or kicked, I would not react that way, right? While holding a tumbler in his hand and standing near him, I told him to throw it. He dashed the tumbler with great violence to the floor and then began deliberately picking up the pieces in a very quiet and patient way. Whenever I struck him quietly, easily, in such a way that he could see I was to strike him, he made only a slight jump or movement. But when the strike or kick was unexpected, although very mild in character, he could not restrain the jumping or kicking motion, but the cry did not always appear. A handkerchief was suddenly thrown before his eyes by a person walking stealthily from behind. He jumped, just as though he had been struck. Anyway, this is in Popular Science magazine, 1880. This is just crazy. He goes on. He numbers these attacks on the poor man. He numbers them like they were a scientific method. This man, number 6. This man, while playing with one of his mates, had thrown him to the ground. Someone approached near and commanded, "Strike him," and he struck him very hard and explosively with both hands at once. While standing by a window, he was suddenly commanded to jump by a person on the other side of the window. He jumped straight up, half a foot off the floor, with a loud cry, repeating the order which had been given to him. So this doctor goes on. He calls it experiment. I experimented with him in the phenomenon of repeating language that was addressed to him. I tried him from the first part of the first line of Homer's Iliad with the first part of Virgil's Aeneid. Languages, of course, but he knew nothing, and he repeated quickly, almost violently, the sound as it was uttered. This is awful. The experiments were repeated again and again, under various conditions, at various times, in such a way as to satisfy myself absolutely that the 6 elements of error that apply to all experiments with living human beings were all eliminated, and the facts obtained with a solid residuum of an exact scientific investigation. The 6 sources of error. Many strange things were done by these jumpers. He goes on. It's pretty blocky text here. talks about beating on them and how they react. Although called jumpers, they only jump in the minority of the experiments. The word jumping really including all such phenomena as lifting the shoulders, raising the hands, striking, throwing, crying, tumbling. Jumpers have been known to fall head over heels over an embankment on which they were sitting. And let's see if we get nature of the disease. What now is the pathology of this jumping? How are we to rank this phenomenon among the neuroses? What relation do they bear to the great family of diseases? Are they functional or structural? Are they physical or psychical? The answer is clear. Jumping is a psychical or mental form of nervous disease and is of a functional character. Its best analog is psychical or mental hysteria, the so-called servant girl hysteria, as known to us in modern days, and as very widely known during the epidemics of the Middle Ages. Like mental or psychical hysteria, this jumping occurs not in the weak or the nervous or the anemic, but in those, as a rule, in at least good, if not firm or unusual health. There are no stronger men in the woods or anywhere than some of these jumpers. Although some of them are injured by being excessively jumped for the time at least, yet to the majority, if not nearly all, this injury cannot be said to be of a serious character. It does not apparently shorten life and does not bring on, as far as I can learn, any other form of nervous disease. It cannot therefore be said to be in any sense a disease of nervous debility. And he goes on servant girl hysteria, like certain forms of choler or jerks as they are called, which appear or have appeared in certain religious revivals, like the Holy Rollers, as they are called in religious revivals of northern New Hampshire. Oh my goodness, he goes on and on about these, the hysteria. Jumping is therefore a transcoital condition exhibiting a part of the phenomenon of trance and bearing the same relation to trance that certain epileptical conditions bear to epilepsy. I'm going to have a stroke just reading this. Although the phenomena exhibited by the jumpers are analogous to those of mesmeric trance, of mental hysteria of the jerkers and the holy rollers in revivals, they yet differ from all these and all allied forms of nervous disorder in these two respects. Number one, the momentary character of the manifestations. In but a second or so of all the acts of the jumper, striking, throwing, dropping, crying, jerking, are over completely, and he's about in the same condition as before he was surprised. And number two, in the persistence and permanence of the liability to be excited. Recent German investigations have, by an interesting coincidence, demonstrated that subjects in a mesmeric trance sometimes exhibit the phenomenon of repeating automatically what is said to them. Berger produces this effect by laying his warm hand on the neck of the hypnotized subject. There were some twisted times back then. Do we have anything more on that? Well, that's about enough of that whole stuff. Actually, that's probably about it for the podcast for today. We've rambled on quite a bit. Well, that's good enough for today. And until next time, this is Downeast Mike. I'm wishing you and your loved ones a day that's full of grace, love, and kindness. Until next time, we'll see you. I slipped a moose a Mickey, and he's sleeping in the yard. I thought that I would free him from a life that's clearly hard. He's moved right in, he cooks and cleans, he even likes to sing. This moose can live right with me, at least until the spring. Oh, my moose pal, call him Mickey, it's all a little bit tricky. We dress in green and hide from all the hunters. And there will come a day when we can laugh and play. Until then, he's staying safe with me, away from all the guns. Oh, I got off track. So spring will come, Mickey the Moose will go, and I'll be all alone. We'll tag him with a microchip and track him with a phone. In my later days I'll have regrets and always think of it. The time I forgot My moose pal call him Mickey. It's all a little bit tricky. We dress in green and hide from all the hunters. And there will come a day when we can laugh and play. But until then he's staying safe with me, away from all the guns. That was the best I could do on short notice.